Hello, folks. We're down the line once again from Boston tonight with political author, analyst, and historian Dr. James D. Boys. I'm Michael L. Roberts. This is the American Chronicle.
This American carnage stops right here and stops right now. China has total respect for Donald Trump and for Donald Trump's very, very large brain.
What is the evidence that it has a preventative effect?
Here we go, you ready? Here's my evidence. I get a lot of positive calls about it.
Nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated. Vaccine or no vaccine, we're back.
It's Monday, June 8th, 2020, and with thanks as ever for your support for this series, we continue tonight to ride the waves of air on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Anchor FM, and all across the digital pod sphere. As ever, tonight James considers the political developments of the week against a backdrop of so much human pain and drive towards meaningful change, with the ambition on both our parts that such open and deep consideration and analysis of said political developments might be of some use in furthering that meaningful change to its rightful positive end for all who have so wrongly suffered in the grip of oppression. We find ourselves, of course, presenting analysis in the context of an increasingly fluid situation on the ground. For example, between our recording session for last week's show and the show actually going to air, tensions across the United States continue to rise, including in James's hometown of Boston, and in that moment the world bore witness to the latest distressing press op as manufactured by Donald Trump. He in front of St. John's Church in Lafayette Square, complete with Bible in hand. This particular photo op also saw the use of rubber bullets and tear gas on peaceful protesters beforehand, so as to clear Trump's way, as it were. I began tonight's interview then by asking for James's analysis of that event, equal parts confounding and grotesque as it was.
So, this time last week, we were talking very much about the beginnings of the protest movements with regard to the death of George Floyd. What you have seen in the intervening week is the escalation of those protests, some of which unfortunately have turned violent on occasion, and certainly last Sunday night across the country, here in Boston, as well as in Washington and in New York, there were certainly scenes which would have been horrifying, I think, to those who sought to engage in peaceful protests. So much so that in Washington, the Secret Service believed that it was necessary to get Donald Trump as president into an underground bunker for his own safety and security, lest the White House grounds be breached. This, of course, runs counter to the self-image of Donald Trump, who does not want to be seen to be fleeing the scene and having to hide in the bunker of the White House. And so it was that as part of the pushback from this, you saw Donald Trump take to the podium to announce a crackdown upon protesters against any violent intent, and indeed in many ways invoking the spirit of Richard Nixon, seeking to position himself as a law and order candidate moving forward into the November election, appealing, as it were, to the silent majority, announcing that he was about to visit a very sacred site, which led, of course, to that incredible image of Donald Trump and his immediate entourage walking out of the White House and across Lafayette Square to St. John's Church, the Church of the Presidents, as it's often known. When he got there, of course, he didn't go inside. He wasn't met by the clerics of that institution. He instead rather awkwardly held up a Bible, which some people have suggested he did upside down, didn't say a word, didn't offer any sense of biblical passages to try and tie this message together, simply stood there and then turned back and went back to the White House, having dispersed peaceful protesters with the use of tear gas and the use of the military. So this really was a remarkable display by the American president. The feedback from it, however, has been almost overwhelmingly negative. We have seen religious leaders come out condemning this. He has, of course, compounded this by visiting other religious sites in the aftermath of this. And, of course, this is not a president who's known for his deep religious faith. He has very cleverly managed to court the support of the evangelical right here. And yet, of course, this is someone who's been married 3 times. This is someone who was, when pressed about a favorite passage from the Bible, has punted, suggesting effectively he likes them all, that it wouldn't be appropriate to choose one over the other. When asked whether he prefers, he was an Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy, he again has said, well, I like them both. You have to wonder whether he's ever actually read the Bible or studied the Bible or knows any biblical passages. And I don't really want to bring faith and religion into this, and who am I to question Donald Trump's faith, quite frankly, but it does appear, quite frankly, that he was very clearly using the church as a political crutch with regard to this. And indeed, the idea that he was using the military to clear peaceful protesters, who nobody, I think, at that point was accusing of engaging in any violent intent at the White House last Monday, simply to engage in a very exploitative photo opportunity, is something which I think has gone down very, very poorly, certainly here in the United States.
I'll come back to questions regarding Trump and his relationship with the military and certain vocal generals, shall we say, this week later. But for now, looking at those surrounding Trump in that photo op, we learned later last week that it had been Trump's desire to deploy 10,000 troops on US streets that Monday night. Defense Secretary Esper was photographed with Trump outside St. John's Church. Your thoughts on his presence there at the photo op, please, and also on the apparent subsequent machinations that took place in Trump's team that ultimately prevented those troops from being deployed.
One of the things that is becoming increasingly apparent in these very strange days here in the United States is that a schism is opening up between Donald Trump as commander-in-chief and both his civilian and military uniformed advisors. By which I mean Donald Trump is determined to project a Nixonian image of law and enforcement and strength heading into the November election. And that is the prism through which everything, quite frankly, has to be viewed. The idea that all that matters, quite frankly, to Trump at this point is those polls in November and getting re-elected. And he is willing to use the American military on American soil to help him do so. Now, there is a piece of legislation which goes right back to the early 19th century, which he believes allows him to do that. The challenge, though, is that there's also something called the Posse Comitatus bill, which prohibits the deployment of American military on American soil, simply because it does not want the military to be involved in any attempt at a coup d'etat or to keep down its own people. So you do have a challenge between whether deploying American troops on American soil is even legal. Let's assume that the American president has better legal representation than I do and a better understanding of this, but just to suggest that that is at least there. What you are seeing, however, is whichever piece of legal writings that you decide to examine, there remains a distinct hesitancy amongst the American military leadership here, whether that's the uniformed branch as personified by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or the civilian leadership as personified by the Defense Secretary Esper at this point, to put American troops on the ground for what is effectively law enforcement roles. The odd thing here, frankly, is that there is an interesting midway that Donald Trump has not used, and that is to federalize the National Guard. The National Guard operate at a state level and are headed by the governors of those individual states. And in extreme conditions, the American president can, if he wishes to do so, federalize the National Guard. If he believes that individual states and their governors are not adequately utilizing the National Guard to maintain law and order, the president can turn around and say, right, I am federalizing the Guard, and I, as Commander-in-Chief, will assume command of the National Guard in individual states and direct them from the White House, effectively. Right. We have seen this in the 1960s, for example, when the civil rights movement was blossoming, and there were concerns about how it was that Southern governors were not enforcing the law of the land. The Kennedy administration federalized the National Guard to make sure that law and order was followed in the Deep South. Donald Trump has not followed that route, even though there is clear legal precedent to do so, instead of which he has critiqued governors, critiqued their inability to maintain law and order, and sent in military police, military personnel, and indeed in some cases deployed onto the streets of America military individuals carrying no rank in the signature, and nobody, quite frankly, has a clue who these people are. That is remarkable, and that's the kind of thing which observers have said you are likely to more often see on the streets of Moscow or in the Caucasus than you would ever see in the United States. So we are in a remarkable period here in America of an American president attempting to enforce law and order through means which many people would rightly describe as draconian, and he is receiving a great deal of pushback, not only from his obvious critics on the left, but also from within the Republican Party, from within his own administration. And indeed, one of the great questions is how long anybody expects the Defense Secretary Esper to stay in his position. A lot of speculation that he was going to lose his job this week and be replaced by Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. That hasn't happened yet. Let's wait and see. I wonder, quite frankly, whether the only reason that hasn't happened is that to replace a defense secretary would require Senate confirmation. And the last thing, quite frankly, Donald Trump needs at the moment is to have to go through yet another Senate confirmation hearings. He probably has the numbers in the Senate because of the Republican majority, but they would be very uncomfortable hearings, I think, simply because so many people are up in arms over the use of arms on American streets against American citizens.
Pivoting now to the Democrat situation and response this week. On Tuesday, we learned of a last-minute announcement by the Joe Biden camp saying that he'd be delivering a speech from the Philadelphia City Hall. In last week's Chronicle, you suggested that it wouldn't necessarily be enough for Biden to run solely on the virtue that he wasn't Donald Trump. His speech on Tuesday was filled with antithesis, rhetorical contrast. The darkest moments bring the greatest progress. Who do we want to be compared to who we are, etc. As I understand it, Biden is now solidly placed as the official Democrat candidate. So your analysis of his efforts to contrast himself this week against the sitting president and his continuing efforts to challenge Trump for the seat.
So one of the things we've talked about over the last 11 weeks or so is the difficulty that Joe Biden has had in, frankly, getting any airtime whatsoever. Mainly because of the coronavirus, of course. He's been forced to stay at home and give a series of addresses on video link from his basement in Delaware. He has made the relatively short journey from Delaware to Philadelphia to make an address this week. And what's challenging about it, I think, and remarkable about it, is the extent to which he's very clearly trying to set himself up as not Donald Trump. whereas you saw and have seen and continue to see a very bombastic approach adopted by Donald Trump towards everything, quite frankly. I thought you saw quite a humble approach adopted by Joe Biden, admitting that if he was president, he was bound to make mistakes, but that is all too human. But what he did say that was notable, I thought, and I'm quoting him directly here, was that he pledged that he wouldn't traffic in fear and division, he wouldn't fan the flames of hate, he would seek to heal racial wounds that have long plagued the country rather than use them for political gain, that he would do his job and take responsibility, he wouldn't blame others. Now, just in those short 5 or 6 sentences, we could spend half an hour talking about that and the context and subtext of those 6 sentences.
Yeah.
I won't traffic in fear and division, clearly suggesting that Donald Trump does. I won't fan the flames of hate, suggesting that Donald Trump does. He will seek to heal the wounds, the racial wounds that have long plagued the country, not use them for political gain. Explicitly, I think, suggesting that Donald Trump does. I'll take my job responsibly, suggesting clearly, as Donald Trump has said, Donald Trump said he wouldn't take responsibility for issues. I won't blame others, suggesting that Donald Trump does. So very clearly he is positioning himself now. We haven't had the convention yet, so it's not absolutely official, but he does now have the delegate count to a point where he will be the Democratic nominee come the summertime, however they decide to anoint him, if you will. Clearly setting himself up as the non-Donald Trump, and that shouldn't come as any great surprise, but the extent to which he is clearly trying to say, look, Donald Trump does things his way, and we know what that looks like. This is how I'm going to do things very, very differently, suggesting that the soul of the nation is now at stake. One of the interesting things now, I think, is that it does allow Donald Trump to be held up as the poster boy for everything that Joe Biden wants not to be. He can point to Donald Trump on pretty much anything he wants to talk about and say, look, this is Donald Trump's way, this is my way, you choose. It's often been thought in American politics that when it comes to the presidential election, there isn't an awful lot between the two candidates, that it's a race to the center, and that you've ultimately got to scramble over basically 6% in the center of American political life. Roughly 47% vote Democrat, roughly 47% vote Republican. So every presidential election is really about trying to flip, a majority of that 6% in the center of American politics. Well, this is really going to be a very different election, I think. Very clearly, Donald Trump has a core group of supporters who were going to stick with Donald Trump come hell or high water. The extent to which he can build upon that roughly 35% to get across the finishing line. Can he get it to 51%? Well, of course, he didn't do that 4 years ago. He is a minority president. He didn't win the popular vote last time. He certainly won the Electoral College, which of course is always matters ultimately. So no one is suggesting he's an illegitimate president. But because of the presence of Green Party candidates and independent candidates, he was able to secure the presidency without crossing the 50% threshold that most presidents, if not all, require to become president. At this point, it looks as though there is not going to be an independent candidate. Several people have played with that, toyed with that, and ultimately decided not to run. And that, I think, actually helps Joe Biden a great deal because certainly 4 years ago, the presence of people like Jill Stein, for example, certainly it was believed helped draw down support for Hillary Clinton, which ultimately, of course, helped Donald Trump. So it's entirely possible that Joe Biden is going to benefit, I think, from a pushback against that. And certainly his speech this week will, I think, help draw those battle lines even more distinctively.
How frequently have we seen presidential races where independent candidates don't run or have any impact upon the leading Republican or Democrat candidates?
It's important to remember that every electoral cycle, every 4 years, the media focuses upon the Democrat and Republican candidate. But if you just look at any ballot, there are always individuals who decide for their own quirky personality, hey, I'm going to run for president. And as a result, the ballot papers for the presidential elections are sometimes quite long. What matters, however, is do you get, on some occasions, more credible third-party candidates coming along who have a direct impact upon the final outcome of the race. In our own lifetimes, there have been a series of incidents where that has had an impact. In 1992 and 1996, for example, Bill Clinton never achieved a plurality of the vote. He was elected in 92 with 43% of the popular vote and re-elected in 1996 with 49% of the popular vote because of the presence of Ross Perot as a third-party candidate who in 1992 achieved the incredible result of 19% of the electorate voting for him. Yet because of the American political system, he didn't win a single electoral college vote, but achieved a broad spread of support across the land. I also remind people that in 2000, you had Pat Buchanan running. That was believed to have detracted support for Al Gore in Florida. One of many reasons that happened was because of the design of the ballot papers in Florida. They adopted something called the butterfly ballot, in which the names of the candidates were on the outside and the box you had to mark was in the inside, and quite frankly, it was very confusing. So you have seen and continue to see individuals who do achieve a high degree of impact upon the presidential election. In 2000 also, you'd had Ralph Nader running as a Green Party candidate, who again was seen to just chip away at Al Gore's support amongst those on the left who thought that perhaps Al Gore was not left-wing enough. And again, this comes back to 2016, when you had a similar argument about Hillary Clinton not being left-wing enough, not being radical enough. So, hey, we can vote for Jill Stein, we can vote for the independent candidate. Donald Trump's not going to win anything. We can have a protest vote. Well, of course, it's important to take those votes very, very seriously. When you consider that Hillary Clinton lost the Electoral College over 3 states, and that 70,000 votes across 3 states ultimately cost her an Electoral College victory, then I think you do realize just how important those independent runs for the president can be. Ultimately, politics is about power, and people who play with politics can sometimes do so at great detrimental cost, not only to themselves, but to the nation.
From a former vice president running for president now to a former president who many have wished had remained president for the last 3 to 4 years, Wednesday night saw Barack Obama speak at a virtual town hall hosted by a program of the Obama Foundation, one in which he asked young people to keep working and stay hopeful and to feel hopeful even as they may feel angry. You wrote on Twitter on Wednesday night that this was a speech that could have been made at any time, i.e. that it didn't seem to address this moment for you. Your reason behind tweeting that, please.
There's a lot of people who have been waiting to hear from Barack Obama here in the United States. When would he break his self-imposed silence? And when he did, what would he say? A lot of people had very high hopes that he would come out and deliver some historic remarks. This, of course, is a figure of historic significance at a time when thousands, tens of thousands are taking to the streets, trying to improve the lives of Black Americans, brown Americans, non-white Americans. It's not surprising that people were thinking, well, what is America's only African-American president going to say about this, especially considering the very hostile relationship which has developed between him and Donald Trump, and the extent to which, as we have discussed, Donald Trump appears very, very willing to try to airbrush Barack Obama from history. And so he chose to do so in an Obama Foundation speech, which was basically broadcast to graduating seniors across the land. And I have to say, as someone who has studied American politics for decades, studied American rhetoric, especially from the 1960s in great detail, and you and I have discussed this many times, I was left feeling very, very disappointed. It does make you realize, I think, how often American presidents are dependent upon key speechwriters. And one wonders how many of them are no longer serving Barack Obama in his retirement, because frankly, this sounded too much to me like a simple chat. He was reminiscing, talking about the positivity of the era, that there's much to be taken from this. Really not, I think, in my opinion, striking the sort of the nerve that I expected Barack Obama to have adopted coming into this. I really expected, not an angry Obama, but I would have thought a note of indignation would have been there. Instead of which he tried to talk about the hopeful signs, the idea that you have a greater sense of inter-community support for these protests than you might have seen in the 1960s, for example. Well, that's true, but again, if you go back to the March on Washington in the summer of 1963, that was successful in large part because that attracted both white support as well as black support. You know, the Freedom Riders who predated that March on Washington by a year or two, that was in part successful because it was white Americans and black Americans coming together to further the cause of civil rights in this country. Simply the fact that it gained support from, white politicians was very, very important. It was not just about getting Martin Luther King to lead this. It had to gain the support of white politicians to get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passed put forward by the Kennedy administration and ultimately passed by the Johnson administration. So I thought that really, Barack Obama had a real opportunity here to define the era, to define the moment, and he simply didn't do so, I don't think. I think ultimately, I felt, and this is only my opinion, obviously, I thought missed an opportunity to galvanize a large part of this country who were looking for a leader, quite frankly. We've seen Donald Trump disappear. He hasn't been in his bunker necessarily, but that is the impression. This is a president who has built a ring of steel, not only around the White House, but around the surrounding area of the White House. He is not being seen or heard of to the extent that perhaps many of his supporters would have thought at this point. He has nothing to say. America is crying out for a sense of direction and leadership in these very difficult times. And Barack Obama, I think, had the opportunity to stand up and to galvanize this country and to point them in the direction of his successor, Joe Biden, and to say, look, we need a new sense of leadership here, and to highlight the positive things that he had done as president and that Joe Biden would continue, not simply to look back and go, well, we had this committee and we did some interesting things and we'd be better off if we did that. That seemed very, very piecemeal and small. And I think it was an opportunity, and instead I think America got shortchanged.
Rounding out tonight now, and I'm thinking of the manner in which Trump has lauded his chosen generals at the time of their having been chosen, that is. Few more recognizable by name, at least, than General Mad Dog Mattis. Before this week, Mattis had stated that he was too old-fashioned to speak out against a sitting president and had maintained that standpoint on multiple occasions when challenged. He was Trump's first Secretary of Defense, and this week he's been seen to come out against Trump, telling fellow Americans, in essence, that the strength of American civil society means that citizens can unite without Trump, in the absence of his leadership, as it were. In interviews with military veterans that I've seen who served under Mattis, I've heard nothing but solid support for and celebration of Mattis's leadership approach. It's always appeared a little odd to me, therefore, that such a leader would find himself at the tender mercies of Trump's tweeted miseries. Questions abound as to whether this is a bold stand by a great general now or a case of too little, too late. Your closing analysis therein, please.
General Mattis has a remarkable record within the United States military and is revered for a whole variety of reasons. This is someone who has seen combat against the Taliban in 2001, someone who led Marines into Baghdad to topple Saddam in 2003, someone who commanded CENTCOM, which oversaw America's wars in the Middle East during the Obama administration. Remember when Donald Trump became president and he chose to surround himself with generals and people with lots of medals, perhaps to somehow deflect the fact that he himself had never served in the military. I always imagined Donald Trump as someone who watched Patton once too many times, a little bit like Tony Soprano used to do on Sopranos, and saw himself in a similar kind of role. It's like, well, if I surround myself by the generals, that will reflect nicely upon me. Unfortunately, of course, people with a military background have a certain way of doing things, and funnily enough, remember the fact that they took an oath to defend not a president, but the Constitution of the United States. And when they see the Constitution under threat by enemies, foreign or domestic, they feel inclined to act, quite frankly. And you are, I think, starting to see the schism emerging between the commander-in-chief and the American military in a way, I think, which perhaps is unprecedented in American history. We've certainly seen disagreements between American presidents and leading members of the American military in terms of active service before. And the obvious case, of course, being Harry Truman firing General MacArthur over his actions in Korea. However, the extent to which the breakdown between the White House and the Pentagon appears to be becoming more fractious every day, I think is a real danger, which is being overshadowed by the understandable, perhaps, attention on what's happening on America's streets at this time. But when you consider the idea that you are having a stand-up row between the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs and his commander-in-chief in the Oval Office over the deployment of forces onto the streets, you really are seeing the breakdown in the military chain of command. For General Mattis, who, as you rightly point out, has always said all along that he wouldn't come out and critique a sitting president, to break that, remembering that he'd only said that in an autobiography that he published last year, really, I think, goes to show you how things have slipped in this country in the past week or two. Just to remind listeners, his statement was, Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequence of 3 years of this deliberate effort. That is a remarkable rebuke to any American president, coming from someone who until recently had served as his defense secretary and who has, as we've discussed, a tremendous track record and respect within the American military. Donald Trump has obviously pushed back against this, as you might imagine, suggesting that he was a terrible Secretary of Defense, suggesting that it was Donald Trump who called him Mad Dog Mattis, when of course that was not the case at all, suggesting that he was fired for being inept in his job. Mattis has now been supported, it must be said, by General John Kelly, who was at one point Donald Trump's chief of staff. So you are seeing this remarkable snowball effect, I think, of individuals with great personal integrity and respect who are looking at this president coming into the last 6 months of his term in office with American streets erupting in violent protest on some occasions, more often than not peaceful protest, and recognizing that the president himself has a responsibility for what is happening, and to those who are affected by this, that he simply is not acknowledging. That snowball effect, bringing Mattis into this, General Kelly into this. We've seen this morning General Colin Powell come out and critique the president, stating categorically that he will not support his bid for re-election. Former President George W. Bush saying something very, very similar. The Republican mainstream community, who it must be said never took Donald Trump to heart 4 years ago and formed the Never Trump Alliance, is, I think, coalescing once more. The big question is, will it be more successful than it was 4 years ago? And perhaps if you do not have third-party candidates to chip away at Joe Biden's candidacy, then perhaps the Never Trump Alliance will be more successful this time around.
That's it for this week's American Chronicle, and with thanks as ever to you, our listeners, to James, and to Chris Warner for our theme tune, we say good luck and ever onward to you all.